Shae Russell for mining.com.au, and it's been too long that Mr. Data Dan has been away from the mic. Data Dan, it is great to have you back again. How are you, mate?
I'm very well, Shae. I've just been in the United Kingdom, and I've had a great week and a half away there. Had the odd chat with a couple of analysts over there, so it's great to be back home. And as the Chinese proverbs suggest, may you live in interesting times, and that's what we're certainly living in at the moment.
Much to my detriment, it just dawned on me that as of next year, we are officially in the middle of the 2020s. And my pre pandemic brain still can't actually cope with that fact that 2020 was 5 years ago. But I can't help but think that we are walking into a very, very different 2025 to the way we started 2020. And I want to sort of kick off this conversation starting around Nissan. Mate, I opened my news earlier in the week to hear that a car company was about to go under.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed it was for a certain brand that I don't like, but it wasn't that brand. It was Nissan, a
Yeah.
huge Japanese car manufacturer that,
Yeah.
there's plenty of them around Australia. Mate, I'd love some insight from you on this one.
Well, a couple of things. It's actually not so much. It's like car companies historically tend to get in trouble when they produce models which no one really wants anymore. So there's in the Nissan case, they've got a partnership with the French car maker Renault, and that's about to end. So the fact is, you've had probably a partnership or an ownership structure which has kind of been not strong, and so the Renault market or the way they approach the French market is very different from the way the Japanese approach the international market. And if it's one of these things, they're not a dominant player in the vertical. So the industry vertical, analysts love to talk about a dominant position in a industry vertical. Now in Japan, you've got Mitsubishi, of course, which is no longer producing cars here in Australia, but then you've got Toyota as the big one. You got Honda, which would probably be a more attractive tie-up with Nissan than Renault, for example. And I think that's probably where the tea leaves lie. So really, it's a case where it takes a decade of pretty poor performance to start to get to this point, and that's really what's happened in the Nissan case. They've got that sales where not many people are excited about the Nissan story, and not like Toyota, which has been incredibly successful at being able to straddle the hybrid story while also having an incredibly dominant heavy vehicle business out of that part of the world. So by and large, I think this it's not unusual to see a car company uh, start entertaining restructuring ideas. I think in Nissan's case, it's two cultures just not working together, and this is borne out after business case after business case. I also forgot to add Mazda into that tail of the tape there, because Mazda, of course, they are a wildly successful export business out of Japan. So that's been an incredibly good story for many Japanese car makers over many decades. But Nissan's troubles, if for want of a better description, are not surprising.
I do wonder what the Australian bogans are going to drive if they can't get their hands on a Nissan Patrol, because I've seen one or two of them in the bush over the years. I've got an FJ, so I trump everything in the bush as far as I'm concerned. But I do wonder what will be the next bush bomb if there is no Nissan Patrol. A more serious conversation we need to have, though, Dan, is around what tariffs mean when Trump comes into power next year, because Australia isn't immune from American policies. In fact, we're very much going to be impacted by these. What are your thoughts on the matter?
Well, I think that it's a very muscular style. It's kind of almost a reversion back to uh, this isolation posturing the US had in the early part of the 20th century. I think, and I'll correct my history here, but I think it was called the Monroe Doctrine. So the US tended to be non-interventionist, which kind of seems counterintuitive to their behaviour post the Second World War. But what does it mean? Effectively, there really is a case where Donald Trump's presidency and his supporter base really is in that blue collar space, and that's who they're talking to now, that they want to protect American jobs. There is also the geopolitical capability story, which is that a lot of countries are bringing back manufacturing, particularly to their own confines or their own countries, so they can actually have a say and determination on that. In terms of Australia, there was in the previous Trump administration, Australia had been excluded from the tariff story, mainly I think because of probably the relationship he enjoyed with the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison, or which no, sorry, it was Malcolm Turnbull, but Morrison and a few of the Conservatives have been well positioned with the Trump administration. So, there's you have to look at what we export, what goes to the United States, and there's areas around food, meat, ag, some wine, but not a huge amount. And then of course there's also the steel component, but it's varying types of commodities which the US doesn't typically have, and so there's also pre-existing trade agreements too with the United States, which would probably be invoked, but given the some of the political posturing and noise around the ambassador in the United States, Kevin Rudd, and his previous remarks about the president-elect, it's difficult to see how the country will navigate the next wee while. But again, I think it's going to be very, very difficult to assess it because there's going to be a material impact on China. And this is really what this tariff policy is directed at China. Trump has gone out before many times and called the PRC, the currency manipulators. And the Chinese economy, of course, has also got that very difficult challenge ahead of it. The fact that its domestic consumption is also challenging. So what does it mean? It means it's not every man for himself, so to speak, but there is certainly a case now that the tariffs are really a marker, if you'd like, about how the US will engage with the world. And while free trade is a great thing, arguably for many in America, the perception has not been a fair thing. So that's really where we're talking about the tariff situation at the moment.
All right, so there's no smooth gear change for where we're going to go next, and that is the data dump coming for the end of the year. Now, horrifically, it is the 29th of November on the day of recording, so we've really only got 3.5 effective business weeks going into the end of the year. We've had obviously a quiet week this year because of the Thanksgiving holiday in the US. Dan, do you even look at the data in the first week of December, or are you like the rest of the world where it's like Thanksgiving's come, we pick up sticks again back in January?
Well, in Australia, that's certainly the case. In America, they're also going they've had the Black Friday and that type of, that's obviously a big pickup for retail sales in that country. It kind of also elevates the inflation story. But I dare say that, obviously there's some big reports which come out. We get, national accounts, GDP. You do get a bunch of trade reports which kind of give you a read on, what the consumption of raw materials, particularly bulk materials and iron ore, coming up over the next week. So the first week of any given month is going to be quite interesting. But it does set the scene for 2025 in terms of we probably won't see the same explosive growth, but if anything, a lot of what will govern growth will be obviously some of the political maneuverings and policy settings that come from North America, especially. So there's a little bit of people going, I can't wait till the year's over. But the next year is going to be very interesting because there's clearly a changing dynamic. And there's clearly a very much a muscling up, if you like, of the United States against China. But again, this also has to be predicated on the fact that whilst the idea of frenemy dominates, the biggest holder of US debt, or 21 trillion of it, significant holder is China. So you kind of go to war with your major creditor. So it's, they kind of, it's a dance, but this will be, it'll play out well. I think for Australia, though, it's still like, we are at the start of what's called a so-called super boom in commodities. And of course, gold continues to tell a very good story the next 12 months because of the elevated levels of uncertainty. So that's where we land, Shae, at the end of November. And after, I did buy a few things during the Black Friday sales, but I think we're consuming our little hardouts. We don't really have much more to buy.
As somebody who could make a full-time job out of shopping, I agree. I have shopping fatigue. In saying that, though, I am looking forward to the retail sales data of November, partly because I do love retail sales as an economic gauge telling you
Mm.
the health of the consumer. But also, too, I bring forward all of my Christmas shopping into this week. So by the time early December rolls around, I'm done and dusted. There is no more consumption for me, or it's food consumption, going into the end of the year. So, from a data point of view, what do you think the retail sales data for the November period is going to tell us later in the month, next month?
I think it's like, I mean, the forecast is going to be a touch subdued. Now, again, remember the retail data you get is seasonally adjusted, so it tends to strip out the spike you get in this. It's all baked in. Actually, if you look at Black Friday sales over time, they've been starting to trend downwards because the fact of the matter is retail's on sale all the time, and so that's kind of been
Hence my shopping comment earlier.
yeah. So that's kind of where we're at. So the retail sales, I expect it to be a little bit softer. The area, for example, here locally, the big retail sales is that the component, what Australians spend their money on, it's either obviously the supermarkets, the dominant sector. Then of course there's the you know takeaway restaurants, cafes, what's being spent out, and that's actually dropping,
Hmm.
right? And normally, and so if anything, the thing which was interesting during COVID was that people were starting to spend more on hardwares again than they were in the cafe. And I'm wondering where you start to get this inflection point of, is $5 per coffee. Now I can tell you now in the United Kingdom it's 350 quid, or almost $7 Australian for a coffee. Is that breaking point for households? And and so like that's kind of where I think we're starting, like we're testing areas of resistance, and I think that's probably the things which are going to start to be borne out, particularly around the retail sector in Australia.
Oh, okay. The demise of the culture of consumption is what I'm taking away from today's conversation. Also, too, I'm not sure if you noticed this, but coffee futures screamed to a 50 or a near 50-year high earlier in the week, due to a couple of problems with crops in Brazil and Vietnam. So the idea of a $7 cup of black gold is horrifying and absolutely not something I'm willing to pay for.
Shae, it's horrifying, but the thing is this: look what's happening at at the likes of major electrical retailers. What's the major category that they're carving out in the shop floor? It's coffee machines.
Is it?
Yeah, they're now like they're now 1/8 in terms of the numbers, and that's a hot space to be in. They've got the grinder, you can get everything like that for $600. To make a cup of coffee, the economics of it, the markups are actually quite high, but the reality is a cup of coffee, when you distill it all down, is around 60 cents a cup, and that's kind of and there's this. And the view is if you can get the high quality beans and you can have a machine which does everything in the cafe experience, then people will, like they become leading indicators, they become signals, and going, well, I'd like to do this. And so it used to be brunch used to be the thing, like go out and have breakfast and sit there and shoot the breeze over whatever. But the fact is, brunch has declined as a cultural thing to do because it's prohibitively expensive. Um, that's no one's fault, but the reality is that's what it is. I mean, you have to pay chefs and baristas, and you have to, people have an expectation they want to sit somewhere nice. That somewhere nice has to be paid for by the proprietor. They have to earn a return on that. So these razor thin margins you now get in hospitality, they also have an effect that if they're not viable, then of course the steel and the concrete and the materials needed to build these issues, and particularly like a new structure, a shopping center, they also then take on a kind of, well, is it worth it? So there's always a supply chain knock on, which like when the space we're in, like the problem is you can't ask one question, you end up asking 10 before you get to somewhere you go, it's not good enough. So it's like a filter. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. We've got this election, which has finished in the United States. A little bit of uncertainty what's going on with car makers, particularly Nissan. But again, it's the survival of the fittest in cars. And the other one, those electric vehicle makers, they got the problem is no one wants a second-hand electrical vehicle.
Mm.
So it's a watch this space. So you say, is December going to be quiet? No, I think if anything, December is going to be very interesting because we need to get a read on what's going to happen with an impending Trump presidency, and that's going to be a lot of sharpening of pencils and revisions.
Well, don't go telling my boss it's going to be busy in December. I was planning for a quiet one, so it looks like that won't be happening at all.
Well, as someone who's been away for 2 weeks, I need to work. So,
Yeah, with your $7 cup of coffee. What is very, very interesting is that little summary you gave us was a ridiculously accurate description of my own consumer behavior that in the past 18 months. I used to treat my kids to brunch every fortnight, and now that's gone down to every 2 months. In February this year, I bought an amazing coffee machine. I know I'll make myself barista quality coffee at home. I've got a Bean subscription. This is what happens when you reach middle age, by the way, kids. And but it is like my experience is very much reflective of what the data is showing you.
well, it has to be, and like this is kind of like um, really like the way the consumer is that's the expectation is that that everything moves for a reason, and so the investment about it is ultimately about return, and a long time ago there weren't as many, like we talk about like coffees, cars, mining, materials. There's a lot of materials coming on board and coming online, I should say. There's a lot of coffee, for example, coming online. There's a lot of cars now being sold. The problem is there's not enough consumers of all these products to go around. Eventually, people become more discerning and eventually new markets evolve in different spaces. And that's really, I think, what we are seeing. We are seeing a bit of a correction. And like those leading indicator industries we're talking about, hospitality, retail, cars, that does have a knock-on effect, obviously, to the material and supply chain. That's how I've kind of tied it back home.
Listen, Dan, I did promise you at the start of today's conversation I was going to keep it brief, but what a surprise. I derailed it. But it was a very interesting chat today. So thank you so much for being here. Listen, I can't wait to get you back on the mic next week so we can start going over the final data sets coming in for 2024. Dan, thanks for being here once again.
I look forward to it, Shae. Thank you. Cheers.